Did you know that there are those who say that there are really two gospels? Believers in the two gospels theory claim that the true gospel is found only in Paul's writings. This is why many Christians unintentionally place greater emphasis on the words of Paul. We need to talk about things the Roman Catholic Church never wanted you to know about Apostle Paul. In the last session, we talked about the faith and works versus faith alone doctrine found in the New Testament. We pointed out the evident contradiction between the teachings of James and Paul about faith and works. Not only that, we also found that there were some discrepancies in some of Paul's own messages. If he really believed that the law was done away with, why did he continue keeping it? I'm going to share a quote from a man named J. Gresham Machen. Listen to what he said. Gentile freedom, according to Paul, was not something permitted. It was something absolutely required. And it was required just by the strictest interpretation of the Old Testament law. If Paul had been a liberal Israelite, he would never have been the apostle to the Gentiles, for he would never have developed his doctrine of the cross. Gentile freedom, in other words, was not, according to Paul, a relaxing of strict requirements in the interest of practical missionary work. It was a matter of principle. Thus, the Pauline mission was not merely one manifestation of the progress of Oriental religion, and it was not merely a continuation of the pre-Christian mission of the Yehudis. It was something new. It was something new. The true state of the case may therefore be that Yeshua, by his redeeming work, really made possible the Gentile mission, but that the discovery of the true significance of that work was left to Paul. There are two key points here: Gentile freedom and Gentile mission. Gentiles are free from the law. It's the foundation of Christianity. What about the Gentile mission? We're going to talk more about that later. But it's very interesting that in regards to salvation, it is presented one way when it comes to Israel, but another way for Gentiles. If Peter preached to the Gentiles first, namely Cornelius and his family, why wouldn't he have received the faith alone doctrine? Why did it fall to an apostle who was not considered to be one of the foundation stones? It seems that the Gentiles were given something that even the chosen people didn't have: freedom from the law. So if you listen to the last upload, I talked about the horrors that Europeans inflicted on those they colonized. They said they were defending the faith. What exactly did they mean when they said that? So we need to take another look at the doctrine of discovery, the 1492 Dom Diversis, issued by Pope Nicholas V. And we're going to read it in its entirety. You're going to see that they refer to salvation in this document. They refer to salvation of the soul and what it means for Gentiles. And it may blow your mind, but all of this has to come out. There will be no stone unturned when the day of vengeance gets here, and the enslavers of Yah's people will be without excuse. If you still don't know what's happening, charges are being read in the earth against the enemies of Yah and his people. So this is the document that I'm referring to, the complete doctrine of discovery. And I want you to pay attention to how it's signed. Bishop Nicholas, servant of the servants of God. Now, hearing this will be helpful for you to really understand what salvation meant in the era when this was written, because many of us only think about salvation in terms of eternal salvation of the soul. It's so much more than that. You can also Google this if you want to read it on your own. Right, here we go. So this is the 1452 Dum Diversis, and let's make sure we understand that this term is talking about a papal bull or decree issued by the Pope. The Pope is authorizing the King of Portugal to fight, subjugate, and conquer those rising against the Catholic faith, namely Christianity. So this document gave Europeans the right to steal land from those who were not Christians. It says, for the perpetual memory of this act, to the dearest son in Christ, Alphonse, illustrious King of Portugal, and the Algerians, greeting and apostolic blessing. While we turn over in our mind the diverse concerns of the office of apostolic service entrusted to us, they see themselves as apostles, sent ones. Although we do not deserve it, it says, by celestial providence, concerns by which we are every day urgently pressed, we are also moved by a persistent encouragement. We chiefly carry in our heart that the well-known anxiety, that the rage of the enemies of the name of Christ, always aggressive in contempt of the orthodox faith, could be restrained by the faithful of Christ and be subjugated to the Christian religion. To this purpose also, when the occasion of the matter demands it, we laboriously expend our free desire, eagerness, and devotion, and indeed remember to follow with fatherly affection all the faithful of Christ, especially dearest sons in Christ, illustrious kings, professing Christ's faith, who for the glory of the eternal King eagerly defend the faith itself, and with powerful arm fight its enemies. We also look attentively to labor at the defense and growing of the said religion, and all things pertaining to this healing work should proceed from our undeserved provision. We invite, with spiritual duties and grace, the faithful of Christ and also individuals to rouse their positions, their duties, in help and support of the faith, as we indeed understand from your pious and Christian desire. Listen, this is the purpose. This is their mission. You intend to subjugate the enemies of Christ, namely the Saracens, and bring them back with powerful arm to the faith of Christ. Bring them back? Who could they be talking about here? They're going to subjugate the enemies of Christ and bring them back to the faith of Christ. So they targeted the Saracens. At that time, Saracens were those who professed the religion of Islam. And let's remember that a lot of our people had been forced into the Islamic religion. They also said Moors were Saracens. Now the meaning changed over time and was often used to denote the enemies of the Christian world. When you look at how it was used during colonization, they were targeting melanated people. It goes on to say, therefore, we consider that those rising against the Catholic faith and struggling to extinguish Christian religion must be resisted by the faithful of Christ with courage and firmness, so that the faithful themselves, inflamed by the ardor of faith and armed with courage, to be able, listen, to hate their intention, not only to go against the intention, if they prevent unjust attempts of force, but with the help of God, whose soldiers they are, they stop the endeavors of the faithless. We, fortified with divine love. They are fortified with divine love, summoned by the charity of Christians and bound by the duty of our pastoral office, which concerns the integrity and spread of faith, for which Christ our God shed his blood, wishing to encourage the vigor of the faithful and your royal majesty in the most sacred intention of this kind. We grant to you full and free power through the apostolic authority by this edict. Please listen, because this is the mission: to invade, conquer, fight, subjugate the Saracens and pagans and other infidels and other enemies of Christ, and wherever establish their kingdoms, duchies, royal palaces, principalities, and other dominions, lands, places, estates, camps, and any other possessions, mobile and immobile goods, found in all these places, and held in whatever name, and held and possessed by the same Saracens, pagans, infidels, and the enemies of Christ. Also, realms, duchies, royal palaces, principalities, and other dominions, land, places, estates, camps, possessions of the king or prince, or of the kings or princes, and to lead their persons. Lead their persons in perpetual servitude, and to apply and appropriate, as in to take, the realms, so on and so forth, that was named before. Now, family, they say the Saracens, but they're talking about taking the persons into perpetual servitude. You will find we were the only people who were said to be taken into perpetual servitude. So who were they really talking about? Let's go on. It says, we carefully ask, require, and encourage your same royal majesty, girded by the sword of virtue and fortified with strong courage, for the increase of the divine name, and for the exaltation of faith, listen, and for the salvation of your soul. Having God before your eyes, may you increase in this undertaking the power of your virtue, so that the Catholic faith may, through your royal majesty against the enemies of Christ, bring back triumph, and that you earn more fully the crown of eternal glory, for which you must fight in lands, and which God promised to those who love him, and our benediction of the sea and grace. I hope you caught that. Do you see that salvation was not just about what happens when your time is up on this earth? No, salvation meant getting everything you need and having sufficiency of all things in the land of the living, and also to earn more fully the crown of eternal glory. But they had to do something first. They had to fight for the faith. They had to go and conquer. Isn't that what Constantine said? Continuing, it says, for we by the dignity of your sacrifice grant that you undertake this work, and with more courage and fervent zeal, together with chosen sons, noblemen, dukes, princes, barons, soldiers, and other faithful of Christ, accompanying your royal serenity in this fight of faith, or contributing with their means, and that they undertake or contribute from their possession or send, as said before, from which you and they hope to be able to pursue, listen, the salvation of their souls. And they hope, by the mercy of omnipotent God and his apostles, the blessed Peter and Paul, entrusted with authority to you, and indeed all individual faithful of Christ, of either sex, man or woman, accompanying your majesty in this work of faith. Indeed, to those who did not want to accompany you personally, but will send help according to their means or exigency of allegiance, or they will reasonably contribute from those possessions assigned by God, we grant, by the power of your sacrifice, a plenary forgiveness. Please don't miss this. They're going to receive forgiveness of all and individual sins, crimes, trespasses, and digressions, which you and they have confessed with contrite heart and by mouth, to you and to those who accompany you, as often as you and they happen to go into any war against the mentioned infidels, and indeed to those who do not accompany you, but are sending and contributing, as mentioned before, to those who persist in sincerity of faith, in the unity of the Holy Roman Church, by our obedience and devotion and our successors, Roman pontiffs, entering canonically to the remaining suitable confessor, whom you and any one of them selected can forgive merely once at the moment of death. Thus, however, the confessor sees to matters in which there is an obligation to a third party, and that you, those who accompany you, who send and contribute, fulfill it, if you and they survive, or your heirs and their heirs, if you and they perish, as mentioned before. So as long as they contributed in some way to the war efforts, they could benefit from the spoils of war. They waged war on us, family. They had a mission. I hope you're understanding this. To invade, capture, vanquish, subdue the enemies, or they call enemies of Christ, and put them into perpetual slavery. Take away all their possessions and property. Is this the mission that Messiah gave to the foundation stones? Was this the mission? As I go on, you're going to see that this mission is very detailed and explicit. It says, and nevertheless, if it should happen that you or others of those accompanying you against the Saracens and other infidels of this kind, on the way there, staying there, or on the way back, departed from this world, we restore you, and those accompanying you, remaining in sincerity and unity, through the present letter, to pure innocence in which you and they existed after baptism. Can we just pause there? The Catholic Church is saying they are restoring these people to pure innocence. They are guiltless and without sin. It didn't matter how wickedly they behaved. Do you see now why Christopher Columbus and the thugs he had with him behaved the way they did? Their salvation meant once saved, always saved. Let's keep going. But we demand that all and each thing which the faithful of Christ, who do not accompany you, contributed for your support to carry out this undertaking, be taken by the noblemen of individual places in which these contributions were given, and as time permits at once be repaid and given to you through secure messengers or letters of the bank, without any reduction, expenses, and salaries, merely reasonably reserved for those working in this undertaking, and that they are transmitted under authentic sum total, and that if the noblemen themselves or anybody else deducted or transferred or seized for his own use from the sum sent for support of this undertaking anything except expenses and salaries, or if they allowed or conspired for money to be either fraudulently or deceitfully subtracted, transferred, or seized, that they incur the sentence of excommunication, from which they cannot be absolved except by the office of the Roman pontificate, if they are in articulo mortis, or at the moment of death. This is the last part of it. It says, for the rest, since it would be difficult to carry this present letter to individual places where perhaps it would be doubted about its credibility, we want and decree with authority that to its transfer, signed by the hand of notary public and provided with seal of a bishop or high court, same credibility is shown as if the original letter were presented or shown. Consequently, it is not allowed to any person to infringe this sheet of our granting, pardon, will, indulgence, and decree, or dare to oppose it rashly. If, however, anyone tried to tamper with it, he would incur the indignation of the omnipotent God and of blessed apostles Peter and Paul. And it gives the date that it was signed in Rome at St. Peter. You all. It should be easy to figure out who they were targeting when you consider that we are the evidence of the crimes committed against us. They took our possessions, property, our name, identity, heritage, and the other people they included in that category of Saracens, pagans, and infidels are still in their land. They know their heritage. Now let's connect some dots. In 1452, the Roman Catholic Church issued this papal bull called the Doctrine of Discovery. In 1454, they extended it and named it Romanus Pontifex. It gave them permission to seize non-Christian lands in parts of Africa. In 1471, Portuguese captains reached the coast of Ghana, and Europeans proclaimed their discovery of West Africa. In 1478, they began the Spanish Inquisition. In 1492, you all know what happened. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And a year later, he was granted Inter Cetera by Ferdinand and Isabella, granting full and free power, authority, and jurisdiction over every kind, over almost all of the land of the Americas. And the rest is history, folks. So do you see how all of these things are tying together? Do you still think salvation is only talking about eternal salvation? Because to these colonizing nations, Salvation was about subjugation, the transference of wealth and power in the name of Christianity. And let's not forget, they were absolved of all of their sins. So why should they ask for forgiveness? They have already forgiven themselves and consider themselves blameless. Another fulfillment of prophecy. Now, when I was looking into this, the overall significance of this went right over my head. Some of you may have already figured it out. As I was thinking about it, what dropped into my spirit is, why is it called doctrine of discovery? That word doctrine jumped right out at me. Folks, this decree is the European doctrine of salvation, and it fits in with the faith alone doctrine. This was used to justify colonization in the name of Christianity and eventually became embedded in U.S. and international law. Are you getting this? They are telling us that this is their doctrine. When you look at how doctrine is defined, you will see that the doctrine of discovery fulfilled every bit of it. A doctrine, a principle or position or the body of principles in a branch of knowledge or system of belief, dogma. Catholic doctrine. It says it right there. A statement of fundamental government policy, especially in international relations. Law. A principle of law established through past decisions, a military principle or set of strategies. Is that not how they colonized all of those different areas? Something that is taught, a set of instructions. We really need to understand the true definition of salvation. Now that we know what it means for them, let's make sure we know what it means for Israel. So we're going to talk about that on the live this coming Wednesday. Be sure to join me for that. Listen to this meme from It's Just History. One is saying to the other, is it really okay to be this cruel? I feel like we're committing atrocities. The other says, the Pope says it's okay though, and he speaks for God. He speaks for God. That's how much they change the message of the gospel. They made the Pope the vicar. He stands in the place of Christ. So they created a religion, a guilt-free religion, I might add. Guilt-free. They're not held accountable for any of their atrocities. So they think. But they knew what they were doing was wrong. They ignored their conscience out of greed and lust. But we know the day of vengeance is at hand. Now let's look at this passage from Luke 1:5-6. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abia, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth, and they were both righteous before Yah, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Most High. They were blameless. How could they possibly be righteous and blameless before Messiah's death, burial, and resurrection? Were they righteous because they only believed or because they did something? I think you all know where I'm going with this, right? So how is it that the gospel of Paul is so radically different from that of the 12 and even of Messiah? Let's remember what Peter said. He said, unlearned and unstable men twisted the scriptures. They twisted the words of Paul as they do also the other scriptures unto their own destruction. Let's see how they did it. I'm going to read some excerpts from this book. It's called Radical Views About the New Testament. And this was written by Dr. G.A. Van den Berg Van Eisinga. So let's look at some of this. It says, whereas in the time of Justin Martyr, we're talking about AD 150, the Gospels were the only sacred books recognized by the Church. 20 years later, in the time of Dionysius of Corinth, there was quite a considerable collection of letters. All our canonical letters are to be regarded as models and types of episcopal pastoral letters. They were the admonishing voices of the apostolic men who, after they were dead, still spake to the Christian churches in order to do something, listen, convert them from the old Israelite standpoint to the new one of the Catholic faith. Now let's make sure we understand. During the days of Justin Martyr, the Gospels were the only sacred books recognized by the early believers. So they were reading the first 4 books and the Old Testament. But 20 years later, it's saying there was a considerable collection of letters. Now we need to understand something about those letters. Those letters were serving a purpose. They were speaking to the Christian churches to convert them to the Catholic faith. Now, during this time when they're getting all of these letters, they didn't know how to separate the falsified ones from the authentic letters. And by this time, they had the Acts, the book of Acts, I should say, the letters of Paul, and a lot of contradictions were being exposed. Certain things were just not adding up. They couldn't understand how Paul could have written the book of Galatians, but none of those things were mentioned in the book of Acts. So the timeline was not adding up. So this says the tradition then that Paul wrote this epistle to the Galatian churches is anything but probable. In addition to this, it finds no support in the Acts or the book of Acts. Anyone who reads his Bible attentively is conscious at once of a great difference between the representations given in the epistle and in the book of Acts of one and the same event. If the epistle is a genuine work of the apostle, written from Ephesus about the year 55, then the undoubtedly later book of Acts has, of course, no right to be heard. So the two who are having this discussion, Bauer and Zeller, they prove convincingly that there is no way of harmonizing the contents of the two writings. The authority of the anonymous and much later author of the Acts cannot possibly be set against that of the writer of the epistle, who describes the episodes which he relates with all the fullness of one who is narrating his own experience. So what were the reasons for the intentional toning down? They had to tone some things down, make it mesh together. Let's see how they did that. Now, the explanation given by the Tübingen scholars was this. They said the writer of Acts was endeavoring to reconcile the two opposing elements of early Christianity, namely, an Israelite element named after Peter, or the doctrine of Peter, and a heathen Christian element named after Paul. But how was it possible that a writer who was acquainted with the 4 letters and recognized them as the composition of an authorized apostle of Yeshua, should nevertheless have overlooked Pauline Christianity and the Paul of the epistles. For this is what the author of the Acts does, whereas in the epistle to the Galatians, Paul comes forward as the absolutely original and independent preacher of the gospel. He here stands from the time of his conversion to his first missionary journey in a position of subordination. In fact, as a kind of protege of Barnabas and the church at Jerusalem. According to the Acts, the universalism of Paul is already carried out in practice by Peter. Immediately after Paul's conversion, Peter baptizes the first heathen. So there's a conflict. What are they saying here? They're saying that in Acts, Paul is the latecomer. Barnabas is bringing him before the 12. He's there to find out if what he's teaching is correct. But when you read Galatians, you see someone who's a bit brash, and he's telling the people they need to hold fast to the gospel as he presented it to them, because, as he said, my gospel came directly from Messiah. Now that should give us pause. Why would Messiah, who gave the gospel to the foundation stones, the 12, go around them and raise up one with an entirely different gospel? And it's contradicting the one he gave to the 12. It's a special message just for Gentiles. But he doesn't reveal it to those he left as officers of the assembly. Would you say it seems out of order? Just food for thought. Let's go on. So let's see how the scholars addressed this issue. It says the Tübingen scholars had only one answer to give to this contradiction. The Paul of the letters, the one in Galatian, was an unpractical, uncompromising radical. They're basically saying the one we see in Acts is not matching the one we see in the letters. So it says, they're going to tell you why. The Catholic Church, which was then in process of formation, could only accept him, only accept Paul as a canonical authority after it had first modified his doctrines so as to make him appear less of an extremist. The apostle of the Gentiles, ignored at first, had to be rehabilitated as an Orthodox teacher by a Catholic writer. Just pause and think on that, and then think about what Peter said. So it says this hypothesis, however, labors under serious difficulties. How could the picture which the Acts gives us of the apostolic period receive such ready acceptance among Christians? How is it possible that the epistle to the Galatians should have remained for a whole century without any influence on the development of Christian faith and Christian life? Is it possible that at the same time and in the same communities, two mutually inconsistent documents of the apostolic period, one that was giving the original picture of Paul, and then you had another with the willful misrepresentation of it? And should it have been allowed by the church to challenge comparison with one another? Now listen, they say according to Galatians 1:17, after his conversion, Paul goes to Arabia, and the writer of Acts knows nothing of this journey. Then, according to Galatians 1:18, Paul journeys 3 years after the conversion to Jerusalem in order to make the acquaintance of Peter. So he goes there to meet Peter. With the exception of Peter, he sees no one else there but James, and only remains there 15 days. That's a long time. So in Acts 9:26 through 27, it says, on the contrary, we are informed that Paul is introduced to the community of Jerusalem by Barnabas. Do you see how there's contradictory information here? It says he's introduced to the community of Jerusalem by Barnabas, and he has daily intercourse with the church, as in he's meeting with them daily, and preaches the gospel. In other words, he remains there for some time and makes the acquaintance of the whole church. The epistle to the Galatians evidently intends to enter the lists for Paul as an independent teacher. This is done at the expense of the older apostles at Jerusalem. He stands above them and has no fellowship with them. Nay, he alludes to them not without acrimony. So the quote is, but from those who think they are somewhat, what they are is not to me. Yah respecteth no man's person. So it says the Acts knows nothing of this hostility, which culminates in the conflict between Peter and Paul at Antioch. Now, when you compare this also to what is written in Galatians, it's evidently describing the same event, namely the meeting at Jerusalem called by the apostles along with Paul and Barnabas in order to discuss the attitude to be observed by the Gentile converts towards the law. Apparently that's why he went there. So the thing is, I believe they created a different version of Paul and used him like a Manchurian candidate to bring about their desired goals. They needed that doctrine. This is why we see preeminence placed on the letters supposedly written by Paul. We see him placed on the same level as the 12, basically dictating how things should be done. In one instance, rebuking Peter. In another situation, we see him being brought forth by Barnabas and introduced to the 12, trying to find out if he's preaching the right thing. I believe he was Barnabas's protege. But then when you read the version in Galatians, no, this is my doctrine. And you need to listen to what I say. So based on the documents I've read, I believe the Roman Catholic Church created a different version of Paul, proving what Peter said about certain men twisting Paul's words. Now, it goes on to say, whereas according to Galatians 2:2, Paul goes up to Jerusalem in consequence of a revelation and without any other summons, in Acts 15:2, we find that he is commissioned by the church at Antioch to act as their official representative. The outcome of their deliberations is that the Gentile Christians should be released from the obligations to observe the Jewish law, while, however, according to the Acts, they are commanded to abstain from meat offered to idols, from fornication, from things strangled, and from blood. The writer to the Galatians tells us nothing of all this, but informs us instead of the promise of Paul to make a collection for the poor of Palestine. So we'll wrap up with this last portion. It says, nothing is said in the Acts of any letters written by Paul. Nowhere do we find any trace of their existence either in this book or anywhere else. Nowhere do we hear a word of any influence that they exercise until they crop up in Gnostic circles. How do they pass from the possession of the communities to which they were addressed into the hands of men like Basilides and Marcion? There is nothing to show that in the intervening period they were circulated round and read by others. When Justin Martyr alludes to written documents used by the church, he speaks of memoirs or gospels, never of any letters written by apostles. Now, let's remember that Justin Martyr is a first century writer. So this would have been between AD 100 and 165. And he only speaks of the gospels. Now, we know that Peter is talking about the words of Paul, the writings of Paul. So there had to have been letters. All right. But for the most part, the first 4 books were being shared because the stories about the life of Messiah were being shared orally, and then the first 4 books were written. Other than that, they were reading the Old Testament. But within 20 years, we see a lot of leaven. Messiah said he didn't come to do away with the law, but in Christianity, the law is done away with. How do we reconcile that? When we look at the controversies, we need to look for the hand of Rome. And a lot of those controversies pop up in Galatians, faith alone doctrine, the Israel of God verse, being used primarily by Messianics who promote replacement theology. They are now Israel. Something is underfoot. I believe the Paul we read about in Acts is the more accurate version because it makes no sense for him to promote a faith alone doctrine, yet he continues to keep the law and celebrate the feast days. Why would he do that? I believe Peter's warning is there for us to know what happened. And we have to be like the Bereans to study these things out to see if they are true. The Old Testament is the standard. And if I can't confirm it in the Old Testament or in the 4 Gospels, I leave it on the shelf. Based on what I see here, the Catholic Church lied about Peter and Paul. They lied and said Peter was the first pope and he gave them the authority. No, the evidence is showing that they created a guilt-free doctrine that ultimately led to the doctrine of discovery, giving themselves the right to kill, steal, and destroy, and then hold themselves blameless. Salvation for them takes on a whole new meaning. So now it's time for us to learn about the true salvation for Israel. Again, you're welcome to join me for the live this coming Wednesday. If this message has been a blessing to you, please hit the like and share it. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Yah willing. Join me next time.